The History of the Harrietenberg and its Environs. Part 8. The Invasion of Dreck. King Leonardo XIII of Panini had not been aware of Crown Prince Leonardo's engagement to Eloise von Schniffelstadt. He was therefore surprised to learn that the army of Negroni had marched against the Emperor Ulrich. His surprise was mingled with disappointment that his son had acted so precipitately and, in King Leonardo XIII's view, unwisely. After all, Panini had fought a war to protect the trade in cedar squirrel fur with Dreck, and Crown Prince Leonardo's declaration of war against the ruler of Dreck was unlikely to help support that trade. And any disruption to the cedar squirrel fur trade would cause financial loss and discontent among the merchants of Panini and reduce King Leonardo XIII's tax revenue. King Leonardo XIII considered his options. The Emperor Ulrich was not a particularly even-tempered man, and would naturally assume that King Leonardo XIII had connived at Crown Prince Leonardo's actions. It thus seemed likely that, if he defeated Crown Prince Leonardo and Eloise von Schniffelstadt, the Emperor Ulrich would then turn his ire and his armies upon Panini. That would not be good for business. On the other hand, if the Emperor Ulrich was defeated in Schniffelstadt, he could be expected to retreat to the earldom of Dreck. In that case, he might not be in a position to make war on Panini, but it seemed unlikely that he would be prepared to forgive and forget. Ulrich might consider that a few frostbitten ears and the resulting domestic discontent was a cheap price to pay for causing significant economic damage to Panini by disrupting the cedar squirrel fur trade. He might even convince his subjects in Dreck to enthusiastically embrace a boycott of cedar squirrel fur as an act of patriotic defiance. That prospect was decidedly unattractive. King Leonardo XIII decided that waiting to see which unfavourable scenario unfolded was not an option. He was not prepared to secure the cedar squirrel fur trade by taking the side of the Emperor Ulrich against Crown Prince Leonardo. He therefore decided to secure that trade by mustering his forces and marching into the earldom of Dreck. Had King Leonardo XIII known it, he could have caused the Emperor Ulrich great inconvenience by occupying the city of Schniffelstadt, which was close to his line of march and completely undefended. But he did not know it. He marched north, reaching Sheep on the same day that his son was cowering under a limber at the Battle of Rotsrager. The inhabitants of Sheep appeared to be largely indifferent to the arrival of the army of Panini. They paid no particular attention as the flag of Dreck that was flying from the town hall was lowered and replaced with the royal standard of Panini. King Leonardo did not tarry in Sheep. Having raised his turquoise flag over the town, he immediately continued his march toward the city of Dreck. The inhabitants of Sheep did not line the streets as the army passed. They did not shower his troops with flowers, but neither did they pelt them with rotten vegetables. They did, however, mutter that the troops were blocking the road, and observed that the army's departure would remove this obstruction and allow the unimpeded resumption of the inhabitants' daily routine. Colonel Ragnar was dismayed to learn that the army of Panini was heading in his direction. As a patriot, he was upset that his country was being invaded by a foreign power. He had fought alongside King Leonardo XIII and the army of Panini in the Cedar Squirrel War, and regarded King Leonardo's invasion of Dreck as a personal betrayal. And, as the military commander on the spot, it fell to him to protect his homeland, and he was concerned that the forces available to him, which amounted to his own regiment, the Countess' own guard, and Colonel Ritter's solitary squadron of Krassenbackers, were inadequate to the task. Notwithstanding his concerns, Colonel Ragnar was not prepared to allow King Leonardo to enter Dreck unopposed. Determined to fight, he summoned Colonel Ritter and Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus to a council of war. Colonel Ragnar's primary concern was whether his Schniffelstadt troops would be motivated to fight for him. His mind was soon put at rest on this point. Colonel Ritter well remembered the reverses of the Krassenbackers at the battles of Tripod Farm and Wrinkle Wood, as well as his own capture by Viscount Colonel Bellapasta and the Royal Grenadiers. He assured Colonel Ragnar that both he and his men would like nothing better than an opportunity to once again cross swords with their old adversaries. Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus was less enthusiastic for battle, but he and his officers would do their duty, and many of the men had joined up at the time when the regiment was known as Eloise's Fancy Boys. King Leonardo's Royal Grenadiers had wreaked havoc on them at the Battle of Wrinkle Wood, and they would like to return the compliment. Colonel Ragnar therefore set out his plan to march out his forces and intercept the army of Panini before it reached the city of Dreck. Both Colonel Ritter and Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus favoured this approach. Colonel Ragnar then ordered them to prepare their men to depart early the following morning. At this point, Colonel Ritter spoke. "Sir," he said, "I regret to raise this point, but my allegiance is to the Countess von Schniffelstadt. I gave an undertaking to Emperor Ulrich that, as he is married to the Countess, I would take orders from him. I did not place myself under any subordinate command. As the Emperor is not present, the Krassenbackers will only march if ordered to do so by the Countess. Furthermore," he continued, looking at Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus, "the Countess is the commanding officer of her own guard. It would not be appropriate for that regiment to march in the absence of orders from the Countess to do so." Colonel Ragnar pursed his lips. "The Emperor placed me in command of his forces in Dreck," he said. "Those forces include the Krassenbackers. You can regard my orders as coming from the Emperor." Colonel Ritter shook his head. "I am afraid that will not do," he replied. "Etiquette and honour both require that I have either spoken or written orders direct from either the Emperor or the Countess." Colonel Ragnar inclined his head. "Very well," he said. "We will seek an immediate audience with the Countess, where she can confirm the military course of action that we here all agree to be appropriate. Gentlemen, you will please follow me." The Countess Bettina von Schniffelstadt was heavily pregnant. As a result, she was feeling both bloated and bilious. She was passing the time by reclining torpidly on a chaise longue, taking the occasional sip of tea, when she was informed that Colonel Ragnar, Colonel Ritter, and Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus desired to speak to her urgently. She did not receive these tidings with any great enthusiasm, but, reasoning that refusing the request would only result in it being continually repeated in future, she submitted to the inevitable, and the military officers were admitted to her presence. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the Countess Bettina von Schniffelstadt. "Please do be seated. Would you like some tea?" With much bowing and doffing of hats, the offer of seating was accepted, and the offer of refreshment was declined. "And to what purpose do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" enquired the Countess. "King Leonardo XIII of Panini has invaded Dreck," said Colonel Ragnar. "Has he indeed?" murmured the Countess. "I imagine that Ulrich might find that a little irritating. But it is the sort of thing that interests him. I know nothing of such matters." "No," said Colonel Ragnar, "but I do. And I would like to use the Countess' own guard and the Krassenbackers to defend Dreck." "I do not understand," said Bettina. "What has that to do with me?" "You are the Countess von Schniffelstadt," interjected Colonel Ritter, "and the troops in question belong to the army of Schniffelstadt, and, as such, are under your command. We are seeking your orders." "Oh dear," said Bettina. "Always the army of Schniffelstadt. Father used to talk extensively about the Krassenbackers and such things. I was never particularly interested, although Eloise was very keen. Colonel Ritter, you may have my orders to dispose of the army of Schniffelstadt in any manner that you see fit. Is there anything else?" There was nothing else, and so the audience terminated. The small village of Trefeld was situated about 25 miles from Dreck, on the road to Sheep. Beyond Trefeld, on the left of the road, was a large hedged field. The road ran alongside the hedge for the entire length of this field, before crossing a narrow strip of open ground and heading into a belt of woodland. This was where Colonel Ragnar had decided to intercept the advancing army of Panini. He stationed his own regiment in the field, with the Krassenbackers alongside them, so that the tall hedge concealed them from anyone passing along the road. The Countess' own guard were placed on the other side of the road, on the edge of the wood. Their position was such that any traveller coming along the road from Sheep would not see them until emerging from the forest, but would at that point be within musket range. King Leonardo was without any light troops to act as scouts. The king's skirmishers were in Negroni. He therefore placed the first squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment at the head of his army, followed by the Royal Grenadiers and the first battery of the king's artillery, with the second squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment bringing up the rear. As the first squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment emerged from the forest, they were greeted by an unexpected and well-aimed volley of musket fire. Many men and horses fell, and others panicked, throwing the horsemen into confusion. Hearing the gunfire, Colonel Ritter turned to Captain Schweif. "That is our cue for action," he said. "Sound the charge. It is time we made an entrance." The bugle sounded. The Krassenbackers charged, crashing through and over the hedge in front of them, and headed straight into their disordered foes. That was the end of the first squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment. The commander of the Royal Grenadiers was Colonel Carnescudo. Observing the massacre in front of him, he did not hesitate to act. Even as the Krassenbackers were regrouping and complacently wiping down their swords, the Royal Grenadiers charged out of the forest, along the road, and into their flank. The Krassenbackers did not await developments, but withdrew up the road toward Trefeld. Having seen off the cavalry, Colonel Carnescudo ordered his men to form a line, facing the Countess' own guard, to screen the rest of the army as it deployed from the forest. The first battery of the king's artillery cantered along the road into position behind the Royal Grenadiers, and prepared to unlimber, and the second squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment moved up behind them. Lieutenant Colonel Lapskaus decided that it would be preferable if the Panini cannon did not come into action, especially as he was their nearest target. In an attempt to prevent this, he ordered the Countess' own guard to fix bayonets and charge the line of turquoise-coated infantry facing them. The Royal Grenadiers met the oncoming Blumen with a volley of musketry, felling many of them before they could get within bayonet range. But many of the Countess' own regiment were grimly determined to avenge their comrades who had fallen at the Battle of Wrinkle Wood, and sufficient numbers of them reached the opposing line to put their bayonets to good use. The Royal Grenadiers lost cohesion and started to fall back. At this point, Colonel Ritter decided it was time for some cavalry manoeuvres. Leading his horsemen over and through the hedge by the road, and so back into the field, he galloped past Colonel Ragnar and his regiment, giving them a cheery wave as he did so, and then crashed over and through the hedge on the forest side of the field. This put him in a position to directly threaten the Panini right, which had no infantry screen. The limbered cannon were at his mercy. Colonel Ragnar did not return Colonel Ritter's wave. Instead, he muttered something about aimless galloping around in circles like an overexcited fox hunter. But he did not feel any need to intervene, or indeed take any action. He was happy to keep his regiment intact and let the Schniffelstatters do the fighting. At this point, the left flank of the Royal Grenadiers' line broke. Lacerated and unnerved by the relentless bayonets of the Countess' own guard, they fled in panic through the first battery of the king's artillery that was positioned behind them. But they were leaping from the frying pan into the fire, running from the bayonets of the Countess' own guard into the swords of the Krassenbackers, who now swept straight into the fleeing men. However, this did provide the first battery of the king's artillery and the second squadron of the Royal Horse Regiment with an opportunity to run away. And they took it, both units heading at speed back down the road towards Sheep. The right flank of the Royal Grenadiers had managed to resist the advance of the Countess' own guard. Gathering his remaining men around him, Colonel Carnescudo fell back down the road and reformed at the forest edge to cover the retreat of the rest of the army. The Krassenbackers had now cut down all the infantry that had previously been blocking their path. As Colonel Carnescudo and his men slowly backed down the road into the forest, the Krassenbackers cantered forward along the forest edge to the road. Colonel Ritter turned to Captain Schweif and pointed down the road into the trees, where the turquoise coats and yellow trousers of Captain Carnescudo's men seemed to glow in the shadows. "What do you say?" he asked with a wry smile. "Would it be prudent to charge them?" Captain Schweif shook his head. "No," he replied, "I do not think so." Colonel Ritter nodded. "Very well," he said. "Let them go. We have won enough glory for one day." Thus ended the Battle of Trefeld.